There have now been 3 deaths in a space of 44 days at the migrant detention facility at Fort Bliss, the Army base near El Paso. One of those has already been ruled a homicide by the medical examiner. 30 people in 2025 at least died in ICE detention, which is the most in more than 20 years. And there have already been 6 more deaths so far in 2026. Meanwhile, the Department of Homeland Security appropriation is nearing passage in the Congress ahead of a January 30th deadline. It passed the House. However, since we've written our border update, the killing of Alex Preti on the streets of Minneapolis appears to be making nearly all Democrats in the Senate disinclined to vote for this package, which would keep ICE and CBP, as well as the rest of DHS, funded for the rest of the fiscal year. If it passes, it may not. Other things going on in DHS. There's a secret ICE memo that purports to say that ICE agents do not need judicial search warrants in order to forcibly enter people's property, which is news if you understand the Fourth Amendment the way most of us do. Reporters' accounts are offering alarming glimpses into ICE and CBP recruitment efforts, which appear to be far from rigorous. We got data from CBP about migration and drug seizures in December. There was only a slight decline in migrants being encountered by CBP during December compared to November. That may be just seasonal. Meanwhile, it looks like seizures of fentanyl have plateaued at the border over the last year after declining for about a year and a half. Seizures of cocaine are increasing, even though 4 months of lethal boat strikes, it would be argued, would be deterring people from bringing cocaine to the United States. There's a lot more in the border update. I am Adam Isaacson. I cover border security and migration at the Washington office on Latin America, and I've been recording these video/audio companions to the border updates for those of you who do not want to read through all 4,000 plus words of these regular border updates. They are long because there is so much, unfortunately, to cover. Let's talk a bit more about Fort Bliss. There's serious concerns about what's called Camp East Montana. That's this sprawling detention facility entirely made up of tents that the Trump administration opened in August 2025 on the grounds of Fort Bliss, which is just a giant military base northeast of El Paso, Texas. This camp was holding 2,903 migrants as of January 8th. It's supposed to eventually have a capacity of about 5,000. It's the largest migrant detention facility in the country right now, but it already faced allegations of beatings from guards, medical neglect, insufficient food, frequent 911 emergency calls from people on the inside, and denial of meaningful access to attorneys. And there are concerns because to run this camp, a company called Acquisition Logistics, which had never done anything on this scale before, was given a $1.24 billion contract to manage Camp East Montana. The alarms are sounding louder because we've had 3 people detained there who died within the space of 44 days in December and January. First, on December 3rd, Francisco Gaspar Andres, who was a 48-year-old man from Guatemala, ICE said he died of liver and kidney failure. An autopsy is still pending. Gerardo Lunas Campos, a 55-year-old citizen of Cuba, ICE says he may have died of medical distress. They later indicated it might have been a suicide. We'll see. Victor Manuel Diaz, a 34-year-old man from Nicaragua, on January 14th was found unconscious and unresponsive in his room. Suicide named as a possible cause of death. Mr. Diaz had been detained in Minneapolis as part of the sweeps going on in that city back on January 6th. For that second case, the El Paso County Office of the Medical Examiner issued an autopsy report on January 21st, finding that Lunas Campos's death, that second man, the Cuban man, was a homicide. The Washington Post have been following this quite closely. In mid-January, ICE had informed some outlets like AP that Lunas Campos, who was a father of 4 with a criminal record, had lived in the United States since the 1990s and had not faced any charges since the 2000s. ICE said this was perhaps a presumed suicide, but the autopsy report from the county medical examiner found that he died of asphyxia due to neck and torso compression, and that he became unresponsive, being physically restrained by law enforcement. In other words, he didn't do this to himself. 2 other detainees told the Washington Post that they had witnessed at least 5 guards struggling with Lunas Campos. He refused to enter a segregation unit. He was saying he needed his medication. He reportedly suffered from bipolar disorder and anxiety. One of the witnesses said that during the struggle, he heard Lunas Campos say, "I can't breathe, no puedo respirar." Both witnesses were given deportation notices days after speaking to Washington Post reporter Douglas McMillan. Lunas Campos's children have gone to federal court in West Texas to try to stop those witnesses' removal from the United States. A hearing is scheduled for January 27th. Across the United States, at least 30 people died in ICE detention during the 2025 calendar year. That's the most in more than 20 years. Another 6 have died in the first 2 weeks of 2026, including 2 of the Fort Bliss deaths. On October 3rd, ICE halted payments to contractors providing medical care in its detention facilities, and it's unlikely to resume those payments until the end of April, even as the size of this nationwide detained population continues to break records. Judd Legum of Popular Information, who broke the story, wrote that ICE's failure to pay its bills for months has caused some medical providers to deny services to ICE detainees. The stoppage is apparently the result of a lawsuit brought by a small right-wing advocacy group that halted a small but crucial claims processing role that the Veterans Administration had been playing. Meanwhile, as of January 3rd, the ICE detained population stood at 68,990 people, up from 39,000 a year earlier. Even amid that growth, ICE has sharply reduced the frequency of detention facility inspections carried out by its Office of Detention Oversight. Last year, 2025, the Project on Government Oversight and American University's Investigative Reporting Workshop revealed a 36% year-over-year decline in inspections, despite these concerns and the increase in deaths. In December, a Washington, D.C. federal judge ruled that, as spelled out in a prior year's appropriations law, ICE had to permit members of Congress to carry out unannounced oversight visits to ICE's detention facilities. However, on January 8th, a couple weeks later, DHS Secretary Kristi Noem sent the court a memorandum reinstating a requirement that members of Congress had to seek approval from ICE 7 days in advance of any visits. The original appropriations law had prohibited ICE from using those regular appropriations funds to deny access to members of Congress. You paying the salary, people denying the access, things like that. But now that ICE has an enormous amount of money from a non-regular appropriations bill, separate channel, the big, beautiful bill, in quotes, that Congress passed in July of 2025, Noem's memo instructs the agency to ban unannounced congressional visits using funds from that bill. The judge who upheld the legislator's right to unannounced visits in December ruled in January that Noem's memo was valid, at least until it faces a separate court challenge. So for now, members of Congress once again must give a week's notice before seeking to observe detention conditions. Even less oversight. Oversight is minimal now, with less regular inspections, less congressional inspections, even as the detained population grows and even as these reports of deaths and other abuse and neglect keep mounting. Let's look again at, even more deeply, at Congress, where the Republican Party has the majority of both houses. They need to pass several more appropriations bills by January 30th to avoid a partial government shutdown. Among those bills is the one that would fund DHS for the remainder of the 2026 fiscal year. 2 law enforcement agencies within DHS, ICE and CBP, Customs and Border Protection, are not in danger of shutting down because they have about $170 billion from the big bill that Congress passed in July. Most congressional Democrats are refusing to support or to vote for the DHS appropriation because it lacks deep reforms or cuts to ICE at a time when you've got all of these citizen videos showing this fast-growing agency's personnel treating people, including U.S. citizens, with violence and cruelty. Despite that, though, last week on January 22nd, in the House, 7 Democrats, all but one of them from districts that Donald Trump won in 2024, joined 213, nearly all Republicans, in passing the DHS appropriation. The bill now goes to the Senate. Now, since I wrote the update on January 24th, we had the killing of Alex Pretty, and it looks like as it goes to the Senate, Democrats are lining up against this bill unless it includes deeper reforms and more accountability. As with past examples of Democratic resistance on some of these funding bills, we'll have to see how firm that opposition is. It's just what's in the bill. As the Appropriations Committees hammered it out in both Republican majority chambers, this 2026 appropriation for DHS would give the department $64.4 billion. It leaves out most or all funding for especially controversial items. And there's nothing in there for border wall construction. ICE detention and deportation is not increased by this bill. The new hiring is not funded by this bill. All of that was in the big bill from last summer. It's already available for ICE and CBP to spend between now and 2029. The 2026 bill would give ICE $10 billion in new funding, including $3.8 billion for its enforcement and removal operations ERO division. That's about $400 million more than ERO had in 2024, but $100 million less than in 2025. But again, this is all in addition to the big, beautiful bill funding. The 2026 bill lacks language that would mandate changes to ICE and CBP tactics, training, and accountability, at least any changes that are deep enough to really be considered meaningful reforms. The bill's important but less fundamental accountability and transparency provisions include $20 million more for body-worn cameras, which they could, of course, fund through the big, beautiful bill if they wanted to. A requirement that with exceptions like undercover operations, DHS personnel must wear standard uniforms. If obeyed as intended, that might put an end to ICE agents running around in jeans and hoodies. It would do nothing to affect the use of face masks to hide their identity, and it wouldn't seem to require name labels or anything else to identify them. The bill includes a requirement that agents receive more training in humane crowd control and de-escalation tactics, and on citizens' right to record their activities if the citizens are not interfering with those activities. That's useful, but the current administration's full-throated rhetorical embrace of harsh tactics, their defense of anybody who commits an abuse, their demonization of the victims, those already provide strong incentives for agents to ignore any additional training. Funding for the ICE Office of Detention Oversight is increased, and for the DHS Inspector General's office to do more detention facility inspections. That's good. Hope it moves fast. The bill would include modest limitations on the DHS Secretary's ability to move funds around inside the bill, to transfer them, for instance, to give more funding to CBP and ICE, maybe taking it out of FEMA or TSA or some other of DHS's components. But those limitations on funding transfers might have less effect because you need Republican leaders of congressional committees to raise an outcry and enforce them. And meanwhile, Section 214 of the bill allows the Secretary to reprogram funds from other sections of the bill to ICE with few restrictions. The bill has a requirement that DHS's Office of Homeland Security Statistics, which began producing some very useful reports on what was going on in the immigration system and then stopped in January 2025, it does mandate them to resume providing these monthly public statistical reports. And there's a requirement to produce a report about CBP's often very dangerous high-speed vehicular pursuits. Now, the Democratic Party has been obviously against this bill, but still kind of tied up in knots. In this current climate of anger, they're hearing a lot of anger from their constituents about CBP operations and mistreatment of migrants and citizens. And the overwhelming majority of House Democrats opposed the bill when it came to a vote on January 22nd. Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries from New York came out against the bill, but he did not, and this is crucial, he did not formally whip the Democratic caucus to oppose the bill. That would have made it clear to the rank and file that if they did vote yes, that would be considered open defiance of party leadership. They did not take that step. So 7 Democrats joined Republicans in voting for the bill on January 2nd. Henry Cuellar from Texas, Vicente Gonzalez from Texas, both from neighboring border districts in South Texas, Don Davis from North Carolina, Laura Gillen and Tom Suozzi from New York, Jared Golden from Maine, and Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez from Washington. Now, 6 of those 7 represent districts where a majority of voters supported Donald Trump in 2024. Trump only lost Gillen's district by 1 point. But, there are 13 House districts where Democrats are representing Trump-won districts, and 7 of them voted against the bill. Gabe Vasquez, who represents New Mexico, his district includes all of New Mexico's border with Mexico. He told reporters his position on the bill was hell no. The ranking Democrat on the full House Appropriations Committee, Rosa DeLauro of Connecticut, put out a statement where she tepidly defended the bill, saying that Homeland Security Department is more than just ICE. Employees of other agencies like FEMA, Coast Guard, TSA, Secret Service would be hit hard if DHS has a second shutdown, disrupting their paychecks after what happened in October and November. Rosa DeLauro did vote against the bill on January 22nd. But yeah, Cuellar from Texas is, under her, the ranking member of the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Homeland Security. It was one of the 7 Democrats who voted for the bill. So you have a split between the full committee and the subcommittee chairpeople. In the Senate, there is probably going to be a vote on the Homeland Security appropriation next week. If they don't pass a bill by January 30th, most DHS employees will stop getting paychecks except for those covered by the big bill. Senate rules require 60 votes to end debate and proceed to a final vote on a bill. The Republicans have 53 seats, minus any no votes, so they would need at least 7 Democrats to vote with the Republicans for the bill to pass. Since I wrote the border update, it does appear that well over 40 Democrats are poised to vote no on the current version of the bill. Before all this happened, the ranking Democrat on the full Appropriations Committee, Senator Patty Murray of Washington, like DeLauro, putting out a tepid statement recognizing the bill's flaws, but arguing that the bill had to go forward because it was preferable to a shutdown or a continuing resolution that didn't even include modest reforms in it. The ranking Democrat on the Appropriations Subcommittee for Homeland Security is Chris Murphy of Connecticut, who did not share that view and has come out very strongly against. He said Democrats have no obligation to support a bill that not only funds the dystopian scenes we're seeing in Minneapolis, but will allow DHS to replicate that playbook of brutality in cities all over this country. Pablo Manriquez, who writes for Migrant Insider and got that quote from Murphy, also noted that Murphy was largely sidelined during the final negotiations on the bill. So again, you have what appears to be at least a modest split between the full committee and the subcommittee chairs on Homeland Security. So we will see what happens in the Senate. But as I record this on January 26th, it does appear that the Democrats in the Senate are poised to use Senate rules to block at least the Homeland Security appropriation. Meanwhile, inside DHS, just a few notes here. The Associated Press and Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, a Democrat and member of the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, both revealed last week in May of 2025, ICE had put out a secret memo authorizing agents to enter people's homes by force without a judicial warrant, in apparent violation of the Constitution's Fourth Amendment on search and seizure, if they suspected that there was an undocumented person inside that residence. That comes from a whistleblower complaint. The AP and Senator Blumenthal first revealed this memo, basically saying that an administrative warrant issued by themselves is all you need to bust into a house. That memo is so secret that those who were briefed on it or trained on it within ICE have not been allowed to keep a copy of it. They've been shown it and had to give it back. And it does authorize forcible entry in some circumstances. Cutting out judges from the warrant process goes against Supreme Court rulings going way back. And it goes also against the Homeland Security Department's own guidance and training materials. Senator Blumenthal sent a letter to Secretary Noem demanding an explanation for this secret policy, noting that government agents have no right to ransack your bedroom or terrorize your kids on a whim or personal desire. There's been rumors kicked around of infighting or a possible management shift within DHS, particularly with Customs and Border Protection. Two reports pointed to some strife between Secretary Noem and the commissioner of CBP, Rodney Scott, who is a former career Border Patrol agent in chief. Anna Jaratelli, a reporter from the Washington Examiner, reported that Noem and Corey Lewandowski, a special government employee at DHS and Noem's close ally, have waged an aggressive campaign to make sure that U.S. Customs and Border Protection Commissioner Rodney Scott is so uncomfortable at work that he would resign. The lengths that the officials have gone to nudge Scott toward the exit were described by two people as evil. Corey Lewandowski ran Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign for a few months. He's not an official DHS employee. He's a special government employee. That's a status that can't last for more than 130 days, but he's been there for the better part of a year. That status would have expired months ago. And apparently Rodney Scott has raised that issue. Scott is a Senate-approved CBP commissioner. He is a border hardliner. He's very conservative. He headed Border Patrol during the latter part of the first Trump administration, and then he clashed with the Biden administration and was out within a few months. He went on to work for the Texas Public Policy Foundation, a very conservative think tank in Austin. And while he shares the Trump administration's hardline stance on border security and migration, I don't think he shares the administration's preference for these flashy media, social media friendly, deeply politicized, and at times violent messaging and tactics. We recall Kirstie Noem filming a video in front of people in a cage in El Salvador's Seco prison early last year, or Border Patrol at-large Commander Greg Movino, who now reports directly to Noem and is very politicized and defending a lot of violent activity. It does not seem that Rodney Scott is comfortable or sees eye to eye with that part of DHS political leadership. Politico reported that Noem and Lewandowski have told people they're frustrated that Scott is not delivering results at the speed they want, and that he appears to have trouble focusing on Trump's priorities like rapid border wall construction. Scott has also turned down requests from top leadership to appear on conservative cable news networks. 7 sources told Jaratelli that if Scott leaves the CBP commissioner's job, he'd probably be replaced by Michael Banks, the current Border Patrol chief. Border Patrol is a component of CBP, so going from Border Patrol to CBP is a step up. If Banks is promoted, Those sources told Giaritelli that Greg Bovino, that hardline controversial chief who's, you see on camera all the time in Los Angeles, Chicago, Minneapolis, and elsewhere, he would be the front runner to fill the Border Patrol chief's position that Banks is currently occupying. We see also under DHS notes some alarming glimpses into the recruitment process at the department as funds from the big bill that Congress passed in July start expanding ICE and CBP hiring really rapidly. They are on a hiring spree. I saw two entertainingly written but alarming firsthand accounts from reporters that point to concerns about the agency's standards. One was at Slate and one was at a local independent publication called Tampa Bay Creative Loafing. Reporters attended ICE or CBP recruitment events and received job offers with little effort and minimal vetting. Laura Jadid at Slate, who actually is an Army veteran, ended up listed as entered on duty and having already accepted a job offer with ICE. She had not accepted the job offer, despite failing to complete much paperwork or a background check. Jadid said that when she went to a recruitment expo in Dallas, there wasn't a lot of turnout, not a lot of other people applying. In Tampa, Valerie Smith went to a CBP expo at a hotel, and she writes, "By never saying no, I was corralled from standing near the recruitment table to having a completed application submitted on my behalf, and I was told to expect a tentative job offer within weeks," which did happen. The recruiter, she said, basically filled out her entire application for her and used an AI website to generate a resume for her even, which is interesting because meanwhile at NBC News, Julia Ainsley reported on errors in an ICE AI resume scanning tool. So the AI generating, AI scanning tool led to new recruits being sent into the field. Basically, this tool said that they had law enforcement experience when they did not. So they got sent into the field bypassing the basic instruction of the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center and being put out in the field with no prior law enforcement experience. The border update also notes human rights and organizational culture concerns at DHS, not even taking into account what's happening in the U.S. Interior in Minnesota and elsewhere. There's links to reports that I recommend clicking on from Kids in Need of Defense Kind, which found a sharp nationwide increase in family separations and harm to unaccompanied migrant children. A report from the Project on Government Oversight, which looked at Border Patrol Station in Ajo, Arizona, as an example of an institution-wide pattern of excessive use of force, weak accountability, normalization of violence. It found that trained agents are often unclear about basic use of force standards in that station. The New York Times did a report recalling the Border Patrol raids in agricultural communities in Kern County, California, just a few days before Joe Biden left office in January of 2025. Operation Return to Sender earned a rebuke from a federal judge. It certainly seemed to have laid out a template for what we've been seeing in Los Angeles, Chicago, Minneapolis, and elsewhere. And it was led by Gregory Bovino, who was in charge of the El Centro sector, which includes Kern County at the time. I should also note that CBP published data on January 16th about migrant encounters and drug seizures at the U.S.-Mexico border. It does show little change from trends in place since Donald Trump's inauguration. Migration does remain at a 60-year low, the main reason because the right to seek asylum has been suspended under a January 20th proclamation. That proclamation is still facing judicial challenges. But for now, between the inability to get asylum, or even a hearing for asylum, and the climate of fear in the United States, migrants really have stopped coming. Encounters with migrants declined from 10,956 to 10,000 from November to December, a 9% drop. And there was also a 12% drop in Border Patrol apprehensions between the ports of entry. The decline was most likely seasonal. One thing we've seen since the Trump administration took office and migration plummeted is that there have been increases in the spring and fall, and then there was a decrease in the summer, and now we're seeing a decrease in the winter, which does reflect historical patterns when the migrant population includes few asylum seekers. Of the Border Patrol's apprehensions in December, 63% were citizens of Mexico. There was a drop in arrivals of people from Mexico of about 17%, which is faster than border-wide. There was at least a modest increase in apprehensions of people from Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, India, China, Brazil, and Peru. 86% of Border Patrol's apprehensions were single adults, which is far more than in the years when you had more asylum seekers within the migrant population. And for the second straight month, Border Patrol's Rio Grande Valley sector in South Texas led all the agency's 9 geographical border sectors with apprehensions. Rio Grande Valley was followed by El Paso, Tucson, and San Diego. And for the 8th consecutive month, Border Patrol reported 0 releases of migrants into the U.S. interior, not a single asylum seeker or convention against torture or withholding of removal. Anybody who had protection claims or any other reason who have been released from Border Patrol custody has either ended up deported or in detention 100%. CBP's statement celebrates that they are not releasing anybody now for 8 months straight. On the drug seizure angle, I'd say there's two interesting things that drew my attention. On fentanyl seizures at the border, I've reported for a while that since the middle of 2023 through the end of 2024, there was a pretty sharp drop in seizures of fentanyl, which may indicate a decline in supply. Since about January of 2025, that has plateaued. We're not seeing further decreases. In fact, if you look at the 4 quarters of calendar year 2025 at the border, the fourth quarter, October through December, actually had the most seizures of any of the 4 quarters, 3,353 pounds. And that may indicate that it's too early to say that that indicates an increase in fentanyl supplies, but it does seem to be pointing to an end of the decreases. On cocaine is also interesting. There was a 42% overall jump in seizures of cocaine from 2024 to 2025. And if you zoom in on the fourth quarter of 2025 compared to the fourth quarter of 2024, there was a 34% increase. That's interesting too, because starting on September 2nd, the Trump administration's Defense Department started using lethal force. It's now been on 33 different occasions to kill at least 126 people aboard small craft that they were suspecting of trafficking cocaine in the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean Sea. You would expect that if that was actually deterring cocaine trafficking, we would start seeing some indicators of reduced supply. The U.S.-Mexico border would be one of the places you'd look for any indication of a decline in supply. It's also one of the only places where law enforcement issues monthly reports about what they're finding. So far, the border data do not suggest any decline in cocaine supplies as a result of these extrajudicial killings. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind. The border update includes a series of links to in-depth analyses of what's going on at the border, particularly that decline in migration a year after Donald Trump's inauguration. And there are some links to excellent immigration policy reviews by groups like the American Immigration Council, Human Rights Watch, the Migration Policy Institute, analyst Austin Kotry and Brookings, looking at trends, looking at policy changes, looking at human rights problems and demographics as well a year later. A few more things that I include in the other links part of the border update. And I know this is a long one, but boy, there's a lot going on. ICE Flight Monitor put out its latest monthly report that gives a full look at ICE deportation flights over the course of 2025. They counted 2,138 deportation flights into other countries between January 20th and December 31st of last year. That's a 44% increase over the same period in 2024. So ICE deportation flights are growing fast. And of course, with new funding from the big bill from last year, they're going to keep growing. Just in the first 3 weeks of January, ICE Flight Monitor put on social media that they had counted 31 interior flights from Minnesota going to Texas, mostly El Paso, showing the impact of the arrests that Greg Bovino's band of Border Patrol agents and ICE agents have been making in Minnesota. It also shows that a lot of people who had refugee status, particularly Somalians living in Minnesota, are being detained and sent to Texas to have their refugee status reviewed. And we are hearing that in some cases, if their refugee status is okayed, which it is in nearly all cases, they're left in Texas and forced to find their way back to Minnesota on their own. ICE deported to Colombia a woman in her 8th month of pregnancy, even though she was suffering medical distress. Just ahead of a judge's order prohibiting her removal, they put her on a commercial flight from Atlanta to Bogota, 8 months pregnant and in ill health. An attorney from the RFK Human Rights Center told The Guardian there are serious concerns about what kind of company would allow someone at this late stage of pregnancy and distress to fly. Deportation flights to Venezuela restarted on January 16th after a 5-week pause before and after the January 3rd military operation that extracted Nicolas Maduro. ICE Flight Monitor counted 3 flights between January 16th and 22nd, carrying 617 people back to Caracas. In a January 12th court filing, Secretary of State Marco Rubio told James Boasberg, the D.C. District Court judge, that it would be impossible to return 138 Venezuelan migrants to the United States to receive due process because doing so would jeopardize, in quotes, extraordinarily delicate discussions with the post-Maduro government in Caracas. The Trump administration had sent those 138 men as part of a larger group of 252 Venezuelan men to El Salvador's notorious Secot prison in March 2025. In the case of these 138, it had applied the Alien Enemies Act to them, the first time that 18th century law had been applied since World War II, despite an order from Boasberg to cease the flight. So Boasberg had ordered in December that the men be given another chance at due process. Rubio is saying no for diplomatic reasons. A State Department memo mandated a pause in processing of immigrant visas for citizens of 75 countries starting January 21st, while the department reassesses screening and vetting procedures mainly to see if the visa processing is scrutinizing applicants enough to deny visas to people judged likely to become a public charge. That means somebody who might have to rely on government benefits in their view. Yeah, Fox even reported that older or overweight applicants could be denied, along with those who had any past use of government cash assistance or institutionalization. So if you're too fat, you might become a public charge, and the Trump administration might prohibit you from having your visa processed. I saw a report in the Mexican publication Novadas, which is based in Tijuana, that said that in Mexico's state of Baja California, which includes Tijuana, Mexicali, around 40,000 U.S. citizens, mostly kids of Mexican migrants, are studying in the Baja California public education system because of the scale of deportations and kids who are now living with their parents in Mexico. On the border wall construction front, CBP contractors have begun detonating parts of the south slope of Mount Cristo Rey, an iconic mountain that straddles the border west of El Paso, to enable border wall construction. Gabe Vasquez, the representative from southern New Mexico, called on DHS to cancel its plans to build 49 miles of new border wall in New Mexico's Boot Heel region. There's a $1.6 billion contract to North Dakota-based Fisher Sand and Gravel to build some barrier in that very remote part of the border. The Washington Examiner noted that the Trump administration built 20 miles of wall in its first year, half of it funded through the Big Beautiful Bill and half of it funded by money first appropriated for 2018. And the New York Times noted that the Trump administration deported more than 1,600 people back to Cuba last year. That's actually citing Cuban government figures on who was deported there. That is about double the number of Cubans who were repatriated in 2024. So why don't I stop there? That's what's in the January 23rd, which really got posted on 24th, biweekly border update, which is on MOLA's website. I do recommend giving it a read and following what we do. If you read it online, the bottom half of the border update is actually spit out from my database a list of highly recommended links to stories about mass deportation and human rights in the U.S. interior that we lack the bandwidth to cover well in border updates because it's not technically border, although it involves a lot of the same agencies, a lot of the same nationalities, and a lot of the same kinds of human rights issues. Follow those links because there is some amazing reporting going on right now. That's it for now. Thank you so much for listening or watching, and I will look forward to posting a video and audio with the next border update in 2 weeks.